Morning, welcome back to another We Are Sunderland morning briefing in partnership with the Farm Museum and Cost Specs Opticians. You can still subscribe to We Are Sunderland. It's £1 for just 6 months worth of coverage. And we've got a little bit of a special edition this morning, joined by Liam Bryce from the Hibs Observer. How are you doing, mate?
I'm very good, Matty. How are you?
Yeah, spot on. Now, obviously, we've brought you down today, virtually, of course, to have a conversation about Nectar Triantis and Eliezer Mayenda's loan spell at Hibs. Obviously, those are moves that went through in January. But if we just sort of set the scene of Hibs' season, prior to them joining, Nick Montgomery was obviously in charge of the Scottish club last year. I mean, I suppose we've got to go back to the summer, really. What was the dynamic like at Hibs at the time? What sort of the main season, the ambitions for the season?
Well, the season before, they had sort of made a late push and qualified for the Europa Conference League, or the qualifiers at least. A couple of good results against Luzern of Switzerland, and then obviously get put out by Aston Villa. But that kind of the European qualifiers sort of coincided with a really poor start to the league season. I think they really struggled to juggle playing Thursday, Sunday. Lee Johnson, you'll know well in this part of the world, was sacked 3 games into the season. And then they brought in Nick Montgomery from Central Coast Mariners over in Australia. But after a kind of initial, a bit of promise, the season was it just sort of meandered along in this sort of underwhelming category, and then eventually took, the longer it went on, took a real sort of dip into the basically the realms where it kind of became untenable for Nick Montgomery to keep his job. So I mean, it wasn't for 2 youngsters coming up to Scotland for the first time. It probably wasn't the sort of ideal, most stable environment for them to play in. Hibs, they had some kind of real struggles in terms of personnel, a lot of injuries. In January, they had quite a few guys go away to the Asian Cup and the Africa Cup of Nations. So it was quite turbulent for a lot of the season. Not a lot of stability in terms of team selection, results. Everything was up and down constantly. And then I think they eventually, obviously, as I said, Nick Montgomery lost his job, and they finished the season in 8th. So a really disappointing season all round for Hibs.
I mean, Triantis will start there. He's somebody who played, he played a lot more football in comparison to Mayenda. But he's someone that knew Nick Montgomery, obviously, from his time with Central Coast Mariners. I've just obviously looked at, for a bit of background back in January on that move. I mean, how was that signing sort of viewed at the time? Was centre-back an area that Hibs needed to strengthen? Obviously, we'll get into, the positional change that sort of happened later on. But was that an area that needed strengthening?
I think it was top priority, really. They kind of really sort of struggled for depth kind of the entire season. They signed the previous summer, they signed Riley Harbottle, who just didn't. That was a Lee Johnson signing, and then Montgomery just basically didn't fancy him whatsoever. He kind of was completely bombed out. They had Will Fish on loan from Manchester United for most of the season, partnered alongside Rocky Bushiri. Obviously, Paul Hanlon, sort of club legend. So he's 34 now. He's just left at the end of the season. He was basically the only other centre back. So it was and Bushiri went away to the Africa Cup of Nations for a good few weeks as well. I think he was away for about 6 weeks all in. So there was a real dire need to get centre backs in, and there still is now. To be honest, they're still in the same situation. Triantis was one. It was kind of came out that obviously you referenced the connection to Nick Montgomery from Australia. He was his top target, really. He was the man that he wanted to get in. It was one of those where it looked, I think, as it wasn't going to be doable at the beginning of the window, and then circumstances changed. He came in alongside a young guy called Owen Bevan from Bournemouth, but he didn't kick a ball in the end. The move went through. It was either he got injured or it was a recurrence of an injury he already has, something along those lines. He went back to Bournemouth, so it was basically Triantis was the centre back signing, which it's not that it went down poorly, because it's not really a reflection on Triantis, but I think Hibs fans they're hoping for a bit more experience to come in at that time, because Will Fish, I think he's 20. He was only for the majority of the season. He was 20. He turned 21 just recently. Rocky Bashiri, again, he's a bit older, but not not that real kind of experienced leadership figure. Paul Hanlon didn't really play much through the season. There was a sense that the coaching staff didn't really fancy him for how they wanted to play. So I think the short answer is it was a huge priority to get a centre back in, and Triantis, as I said, was Montgomery's. It was his top target for the position.
Yeah, I mean, as you touched on there, he's not a sort of an experienced centre half, and that was an issue that Sunderland had in the summer. Obviously, he was viewed as a longer term sign, and if I'm just looking at the some of the stats from when he first made the move up there, first 3 games or so he operated at centre half. It was a 3-0 defeat to St Mirren and then a 2-1 defeat at Celtic. How did he fare in those sort of first couple of games?
It was not great, to be honest. I mean, he's, to give it a bit of context, he was really kind of thrown in at the deep end.
Yeah.
As I said, Rocky Bashiri was away at AFCON. He was put in alongside Will Fish, 2 very young centre backs. I think that game against St Mirren in particular, it was Triantis. He played left centre back next to Will Fish, and then Hibs had just a 16-year-old from the academy, young Rory Whittaker, playing right back, just because basically at that point there was nobody else. But he didn't. He looked, as I said, he was thrown in a bit at the deep end. So I think you could argue that there was some mitigated circumstances there, because that game against St Mirren was probably Hibs collectively the worst performance of the entire season. It was awful. It was like one of those where I think that the team get booed off at half time, and then they get booed back onto the pitch for the second half. So that's kind of gives you of how generally bad it was that day. Triantis, he gave away a penalty. It was a wee bit unlucky. The ball's bounced up from about a yard away from him into the box. He's trying to get stuck in, and it's hit his hand. It's one of those, can happen. And then I'm pretty sure they were 3-0 at half time, and then I think he lost his man for the second or third goal from a corner. Just got into a bit of a twist, really. Didn't follow the man. Celtic game was only a few days later. He gave away another penalty just, I think it was only about 5-6 minutes in. Again, he's gone up for a header. It's a high ball in the box. Him and the Celtic player have both gone for it at the same time. The Celtic player gets there split second ahead of him, and he's gone for the ball, but he's basically headbutted the lad in the back of the head. Ref's given a penalty. It was a bit... Again, it's one of those he's got to go for, but it's there was an element of maybe kind of over eagerness to get stuck in sometimes for young players. Possibly an element of that. But Hibs actually then played for the rest of the game. They were really good that night. They eventually lost 2-1, but were probably the better side. Limited Celtic to very little. I think Triantis had a decent game. On top, he kind of bounced back. It would have been easier for him to completely go under after conceding second penalty in as many games. Did fine that night. I remember you could see that he was good on the ball. I think that was the thing that kind of stuck out. And it certainly stuck out when I was maybe watching a wee bit of footage of him before he came up. And even the St Mirren game, you could tell that he could handle the ball well. He had a range of passing. It was just the defensive side that he was having maybe a hard time adjusting to. That, in fact, the following game actually was probably, I think that was the last time he played at centre back. The following league game, if I'm not mistaken, it was a 2-2 draw at Aberdeen. But you could probably say that he was at fault for both Aberdeen goals. First one was just, I think it's a second phase from a set piece. First one, he didn't push up to get out, plays the lad onside, and then doesn't react to the second ball. So it was after that I think Montgomery was. I think Bashiri came back from the AFCON at that point, and he spent a few weeks out of the team after that. So that was the last time I think he played centre back, or certainly started at centre back, I think.
Yeah, it sounds like again you've just sort of reiterated the fact that it certainly felt from the outside that it was a bit like a baptism of fire, having been dropped in there, as you say, for all those the mitigating circumstances. He perhaps didn't cover himself in a lot of glory on the pitch. Do you think that was just down to the lack of experience, maybe? Because I know, as we'll touch on in just a second, he did end up dropping down and playing some sort of, was it youth under 21s style football at Hibs during that period when he was dropped?
Yeah, I think there was probably I wouldn't say that was maybe entirely just because he'd been bombed out into the youth squad. I think there was a few international breaks at that time. He didn't play. He hadn't been playing, and Montgomery wasn't averse to just, if guys hadn't been playing, he wasn't averse to just sending him out to a development game. So it wasn't really a case of he was banished down to the youth team. It was just something that he did. I think quite a lot. If guys hadn't had much game time, they would join in with the development squad. But he did. He was out of the team for a few games, and I think there was probably an element of the inexperience.
Yeah.
Probably wasn't match fit when he came up either. And we like to bang on about it up here, but as a physical league, you do need to be sort of ready for that physical side of it. In terms of, I think the St Mirren game in particular, it was just aerial bombardment, balls into the box, long balls. It's probably an adjustment from playing under 23, Premier League 2 type fixtures. It's sorry, you know what I mean. It was an adjustment, and I think with the other factors that I mentioned as well, just the amount of instability around the team, that probably didn't help whatsoever. But then, as you said, he did go on to do really well in midfield. So it was just, but I think you could tell that it was maybe inexperience, and not having that experience beside him as well. It was two young guys. It was, but I mean, I wouldn't. I certainly wouldn't write him off as a centre half based on that period, because it was, he wasn't the only one who was underperforming. But yeah, it was certainly a difficult few weeks for him, I'd say.
I suppose it sort of leads into the crux of the conversation that we're going to have here, because Sunderland themselves, they brought him in as a centre half, but just from the outside again, looking at comments on social media, etc. After that sort of switch into midfield, I don't know, it seemed, at least from what supporters were saying online, that he really sort of came into his own. Sunderland need a sort of holding midfield player. What sort of role did he play there for Hibs? And do you think, I know you've said there that you wouldn't rule him out, playing at centre half in the future, but do you think that, how did he fare in that sort of holding midfield role?
It was almost kind of bizarre how natural he looked in that position compared to centre half, because I think some of the problems at centre back where he was making maybe positional errors, he wasn't pushing up at the right times. It was just kind of betraying a sort of lack of maybe experience and understanding of the role. But then when he went into midfield, it was that way. If you'd played those few weeks in reverse, people would have been like, why are they putting this really good centre midfielder on the centre back? Because he just, as I said, he just looked quite natural in terms of everything that he was doing, in terms of, especially in the way he was receiving the ball, the way he was, protecting the ball, his pass selection, his range of passing. It was like sometimes when you put centre backs into midfield, they're just there to just to provide a bit of steel and run about and kick people maybe. But he looked he looked quite cultured, and I think he did when he only spoke to the press once. He came across quite a quiet, reserved lad. But he did say that he'd played further forward in Australia, and then the older he got, obviously he's a big lad. The taller he got, he said the further back the pitch he got moved. But yeah, it was for a few weeks. He looked kind of every bit, possibly the solution for a midfield that, as I've kind of reiterated plenty of times, it's Hibs' backline was a real weak point, and they needed somebody, it can make a huge difference in front of that if you've got a good screen and holding midfielder who can protect them almost. Because the first game he played in there, it was a Rangers home to Rangers Scottish Cup quarter final, and it was obviously a bit of a surprise to see him back into the team, because he'd struggled a fair bit. We've seen him in midfield. There'd been no, I think Montgomery maybe mentioned it, that he'd played midfield before, but we certainly weren't expecting him to go in there, because Hibs had signed a couple of midfielders in January. But he was probably Hibs' best player that night, to be honest. They lost 2-0 in the end, but he didn't look out of place against a team that were flying in Rangers at that moment in time. They at that point they looked as though they were maybe going to go on and win the league. So it was. And I think we were kind of looking for positives, and we did a big piece on him after that game, just for the fact that it was such a big talking point as to how much more comfortable he looked. So just as I said, he just looked far more natural in that role, as though that is where he'd played his entire career. It was good to see. Do you know what I mean? It was interesting to watch. And as I said, not 100% sure on how many games he played there before he maybe dropped back out again. But certainly for a few weeks, he really did look the part playing there.
It's interesting because obviously we'll have pre-season coming up. We'll see what sort of role he'll fit in there. But given that sort of holding midfield role, I'd be surprised. I'd certainly like to see him given an opportunity there, just based on some of the stuff that you've said. Was he an out-and-out number 6? He didn't sort of, flit in between, I don't know, maybe a box to box. He was very much someone who would screen the back four.
Yeah, occasionally, he's got that big kind of long stride.
Yeah.
He's obviously a big lad. Occasionally, you'd see him breaking forward, but I mean, the majority of the time, he was just kind of sitting in front of the back four. He played next to Hibs captain Joe Newell, who's probably got a bit more license to get forward. And they'd started playing with a number 10 at this point as well. So he was the guy who was there to maybe try and put out fires, but also there was it wasn't like he wasn't trusted to be really involved in the build-up either. As I said, the way he receives the ball, how he's used of it, good range of passing as well. It's not just like he was knocking the ball backwards and sideways 5-10 yards. He could go a bit longer as well. He could use his body to get away from players. It was I said he maybe again, young player, probably going to be inconsistent. He probably maybe tailed off a wee bit after a few weeks when Hibs kind of, because there was a slight upturn in form, and I think it was probably in part down to that, partly down to a few other factors as well. And then just as they did the entire season, it kind of dipped again. The manager wanted to change things, but yeah, it was kind of very much sort of holding in front of that back four, which was something that they really needed at that point in time.
Yeah, I suppose, how do you view his loan spell as a whole? Because you can sort of split it into two parts, can't you, really, after centre-half role perhaps didn't work out, but as a central midfielder, holding midfielder, how do you sort of view his tenure there?
I was certainly impressed with him playing that role, and I think quite a few Hibs fans were as well. I think there was I shared a video on Twitter a few weeks ago of it was like kind of every touch he had in one of his last games, and there was quite a few people saying, I'd certainly take him back. He was playing in a midfield role because, as I said, he just looked, it was night and day. I felt the difference. And even, I think it was quite telling as well when, after Nick Montgomery got sacked, the interim manager, David Gray, who stepped in to take the team for the last two games, he said after the Montgomery's last game, they got beat 4-0 at Aberdeen. I don't think Triantis played that day. And then basically the first thing that the interim manager did for the last couple of games of the season was put Triantis back into midfield. And I think they certainly looked a bit more, it was two dead rubbers, basically, so you've got to put it into that context, but they certainly looked a bit more solid. So centre-half, jury's out probably still on whether he can, whether that's somebody can play moving forward. But I certainly saw a lot of potential as a number 6, as a midfielder.
Yeah, and then obviously we'll move things on to Eliezer Mayenda. Now, obviously from a Sunderland context, he didn't particularly play a lot of senior football. The majority of it came off the bench. He was really sort of favoured under Tony Mowbray, and Michael Beale sort of bigged him up. So it did come as a surprise when he left as late on as he left in the January transfer window. On one hand. On the other hand, the fact that, he needed to go out and play football, still such a young striker. I suppose that, the same sort of question to you that I posed to you about Triantis. Was the up front area an area of the pitch again that needed strengthening?
Probably, I think when everybody was fit, I wouldn't say it was a priority, and certainly not, bringing in terms of maybe them bringing in a young lad who hasn't played much first team football. But as I said, there was always guys unavailable. There was injuries. But in terms of priority, I wouldn't have said it was a massive priority. I think Hibs' two sort of best attacking players this season, Mizian Malida and Eliezer, who played on either flank or could play through the middle if needed. They were certainly quite strong. That Martin Boyle, who's been kind of a talisman for many years, he did go away to the Asian Cup around that point. So I don't know if they were maybe just looking for just an extra body at one point. But we were kind of surprised as well, because it was announced right before the deadline. Nobody really saw it. It wasn't one that it maybe came out beforehand as potentially happening. So nobody really saw it coming. It kind of got, I think, in terms of coverage and stuff, it maybe got a wee bit lost in amongst other signings that were a wee bit more high profile. So yeah, it did feel like a bit of a strange one at the time, even though that we had heard that he was quite a highly rated young man.
Yeah.
But it didn't really pan out that way, to be honest.
Yeah, I was going to say he only played something like 109 minutes or something like that. I mean, when he did play, what sort of role did he play? Because again, this has been a talking point at Sunderland about the strikers last year. They scored 3 between the 4 of them who they did sign in the summer. Tony Mowbray again bigged him up. He thought he was had the highest potential, highest ceiling, looked the furthest ahead. Then obviously when Michael Beale came in, he gave Nazari Rusin more game time. I'm intrigued as to what sort of role, albeit I understand there's not a great sort of scope to go off, but what sort of role did he play?
Yeah, well, the one start that he made was it was away to Inverness Cali Thistle in the Scottish Cup, and he was played off the left that day. Ended up getting subbed at half time, if I remember right. And I know, like, this might not seem like the most analytical or greatest insight, but I think it's maybe quite telling in itself.
Yeah.
I can't really remember anything that he did in the game. And it was, again, it's difficult. It was maybe he'd only been there a few weeks, maybe a difficult one to come into. There was a lot of change in the team, new guys and stuff. So the game, I remember that game just kind of passing him by a wee bit. Didn't, it's not like I came away from it thinking he did anything particularly wrong. He just struggled to get involved a wee bit. And then the other appearances that he made, I feel like it'd be pretty harsh to make any real sort of judgment on, because I think at times he was thrown on in games that were lost already, games that were gone for maybe 10 minutes or 15 minutes here or there, games that were already won. He did come on through the middle a couple of times, and he just, I mean, he's what you expected from a young player trying to make an impression. He was full of energy, full of willingness to get about, try and get himself involved, but I think games just kind of passed him by, from what I remember.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's something that I was going to ask you about, because again, the fact that he hasn't played a lot of minutes can normally be quite telling, because I know certainly from a Sunderland persuasion, people have questioned it. Why has he gone out on loan to not play? I'm interested, was there anything said about him from Nick Montgomery just on the loan itself, maybe why he wasn't getting minutes?
Not that springs to mind. That may well have done at some point. I apologise. I don't know right off the top of my head. I remember it. He talked him up a fair bit when he came in, as as basically everything you'd expect. Promising young player, gives us another option in attack. But I think he was maybe because he was quite out of the picture for a lot of the time. Then maybe folk really weren't asking questions about him, to be honest. And there was so much other stuff going on a lot of the time in terms of the team's form, the manager's future, and stuff like that. I can't remember him too often really mentioning him much, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, there, it certainly felt like a bit of a strange one. I suppose the consensus of that would be, from a Sunderland persuasion anyway, that he perhaps get another loan out elsewhere. From a Triantis point of view, I did find that interesting that some supporters would have him back. Do you think that could be, a possibility next season? Obviously, there's plenty of other things that have to come into factor. Sunderland's head coach, whether they fancy him or not. But do you think it's something that, Hibs would certainly entertain?
It's difficult to say at the moment, because there's a lot of upheaval at Hibs as well. We've just appointed a new sporting director, Malky Mackay, who started at the beginning of this week. Not appointed a new head coach yet. That process is still ongoing. And there's a big clear out to come as well. They had around towards the end of last season, there was something about like 40 contracted players on the books. So there's a clear out to come there. There's a few guys whose future is maybe a wee bit uncertain. But for me, if it was a possibility, this is just from somebody who's watched him and who was quite a big fan of him playing in that midfield role. If it's another loan, I mean, I think it would be certainly something worth entertaining, because he did look to have a lot of potential in that position. Whether he would fancy it again, I don't know, because I mean, it wasn't the greatest half season, and the fact that Nick Montgomery is was the guy who brought him up. He obviously knows very well, has a good relationship with him now that he's gone as well. Would he himself be interested in it? But I don't know. But I from a certainly a personal point of view, I did rate him in that role, and I felt like he had certainly had potential to to sort of cover that. It was a bit of a problem position at times in terms of having that kind of sort of out and out number 6. Joe Newell next to him, the captain, plays pretty much every game, but you wouldn't say he's your sort of classic number 6. In terms of somebody that dictates games, he's more of an all-rounder. Joe Newell does a bit of everything, so to have maybe somebody who can just sit in front of the back 4, take the ball as well as Triantis can, use it, I thought it'd be worth a look. But I'm kind of sitting on the fence here a wee bit, but I think it would just be too early to say, depending what the new manager thinks, whether it's a possibility. I think obviously you've touched on it there as well. There's a new Sunderland manager coming in as well. He's probably going to want to have a look at him. So I think if it was one that would happen, I would predict it's maybe something that maybe a bit further down the line.
Yeah, that's great, Liam. Thanks a lot. Plenty of food for thought there. We are Sunderland in partnership with the Farm Museum and Cospex Opticians. Again, it's just £1 to subscribe to our website for 6 months worth of coverage. Thanks for joining us.